So we look very carefully at consumption, and we recognize that even though durables are cyclically sensitive, and the biggest part of our spending is on services, and of course we always buy non-durables, food, clothing, fuel, and the like, consumption is very, very important for us to look at. And here is one other point about consumption, that from the standpoint of an economics class, or from the standpoint of an economist, this is the one thing, and I say one thing, upon which you can always lean. You know, there are very, very few laws of economics, a law meaning it is irrefutable. It's never wrong, but this is one of them. And that is that consumption is a function of disposable income. That has been true forever. It will be true into the future. To some extent, consumption is a function of disposable income. Somebody just asked a question um, about durable goods. I'm sorry, I couldn't see that. So if you just had a question that you wrote out, would you please repeat it orally so we could hear it?
Yeah, sure. I was just asking, were you saying that consumption as a whole is cyclically sensitive or just durable goods?
Just durable goods consumption is cyclically sensitive. You know, if you think about non-durables, for example, just take food. If the economy is going great, you may actually eat less food. And the reason why is you might eat more nutritious food. But certainly you don't have two bellies. So if let's say your salary doubled, you're not going to eat twice as much food. So it's not going to be cyclically sensitive. On the other hand, if the economy really goes badly, you might cut down to some extent on the amount of food you consume. In fact, you may cut down significantly, but everybody isn't going to. So it's not going to be cyclically sensitive. And services are a function of lifestyle. Lifestyle meaning the trade-off between work and leisure, how we choose to live. Some people, like my wife, sometimes she'll say, I'm going to get my hair done. And I'll go, your hair looks great. She'll go, no, it looks terrible. I go, no, it looks fabulous. Why are you going to get your hair done and spend $9,000? No, I'm exaggerating, but a huge amount of money to get your hair done when it looks good. She goes, because I don't know, I just like it when it's, a certain way. That's a lifestyle consideration. Okay, so services could be that, and services are also a function of labor force participation or preferences, and mainly the fact that we can afford them. There may have been a time when you filled out your own income tax return, and maybe you made mistakes, maybe you didn't. But if you could afford to have an accountant do it, it more than pays for itself, because that accountant might find loopholes, different deductions that you might be able to take, or exemptions or credits, whatever that you could take, that would probably pay for the accountant's fee. But if you don't have the money for the accountant's fee, you don't buy that service. Well, more and more people having more and more income. Remember, the 2 years before the pandemic, we had an unemployment rate below 4%. So people were working, and it probably made sense for them to go to an accountant, whether it was a chain like H&R Block or something like that, or to, an individual accountant that you may know, who you trust, who fills out your tax return. The fact is, if you could afford the fee, you do it. So services tend not to be cyclically sensitive. Non-durables like food, not cyclically sensitive, but durables certainly are. Okay? You know that car sales are going to go down when you're in a recession, and car sales are going to go up when the economy is growing more and people have more jobs. Okay? So we're going to go pretty fast, actually. So much of what we're about to see, you've already seen. So I'm not going to go through all these bullet points. These are here for you. They're there really for you, for your study purposes. So let's just talk about them. And this starts out by saying that each person's spending habits, needs, wishes, and patterns differs. The same is true in the aggregate across groups and even across countries. Historically, for example, East Asians have had lower average propensities to consume than North Americans. That's a cultural difference. It's not that the economies are so vastly different, even though they may be. There's a cultural difference. There was a time in the 1980s when the typical savings rate in Japan was around 18%. At the same time, it was 5, 4, 3, 2% in some of the Western countries. It was just a preference. And different responses to how things are going. In the US, when the economy would turn towards slower growth or toward recession, people would continue to try to defend their lifestyle and to spend the way they were before, and savings rates would actually drop. In many of the Eastern countries, when the economy would start to turn south, grow more slowly, or actually decline into recession, people would get scared and they would save more as a share of their disposable income. Different cultures, different ways of looking at things. And indeed, that's true across every single one of the 51 of you who are with us this morning. No two people have the same spending patterns. The things that drive you are different. Psychologically, which I'll get into in a few minutes, but financially, economically, culturally, maybe even in terms of your religion. All these things are very different across all of us. No two people are the same. And of course, if we talk about spending, which comes out of disposable income, the other thing we can talk about is savings. And of course, the same thing is true. Some people will say, savings are really important to me. I will always take a set percentage of my paycheck and put it into a 401k, a 403b, a 425 plan, or if you don't have one of those, I'll set it aside and I'll put it in the bank. I'll pay myself first, which is a philosophy that some financial advisors will tell you. I don't. I think that's a bad idea. But other people will say, you know what? If I earn $100, I'm going to spend $100. Hey, I'm young. I'm going to enjoy every day of my life because I can't get back my youth. So what I'm going to do is just enjoy every day of my youth, and every dollar that I earn, I'm going to spend it and enjoy it. And when I'm a little bit older and my paycheck is bigger, then I'll worry about savings. Totally different philosophy. Let's look at savings or attitudes toward money. Rhetorical question. Think about this for a minute. There is no right answer. If I were to say to you, 2 blocks from your home, but up on the top of a hill, underneath a blue garbage can that I could tell you about, there is a $50 bill. Would you go immediately to turn over that garbage can and find that $50 bill, or would you say, it's not worth it to get up? It's kind of dreary outside today. It's a little cold. I don't want to put on a jacket. I don't want to walk up the hill. Some people might run to pick up that $50 bill. Others of you might say, it's not worth it. Everybody's different. And so that's how spending patterns are different. What I want you to understand is that the one truism is that disposable income on a macro basis is a function of, consumption and savings as a function of disposable income is the only truism in economics that never goes wrong. I mean, we even sometimes have downward sloping supply curves. So the law of supply and demand isn't much of a law, but that always holds true. But the other thing I want you to keep in mind is, even though we're looking at macroeconomics is the summation of what happens among the micro units, and every micro unit is different. So I might calculate the average grade in the class on the second exam. That might be totally meaningless. It doesn't say anything about how frequently that grade came up. It doesn't say anything about who are the people who got the grades in the 90s and who got them in the 60s, and doesn't say anything. Everybody's different. The mix of spending among durables, non-durables, and services can also vary widely across individuals and countries. I guess I've just addressed that. So, as you know, we've already addressed several theories of consumption that have come up. We've talked about the relative income hypothesis and the notion that people are emulative, that they are emulative of people in the next sort of, I don't know, I'll just call it category that they admire, and they try to spend in order to be like those whom they admire. But you can't go too far, because I might admire, a player on the Yankees who's earning $40 million a year, but I can't spend like that person. But I can spend like my next door neighbor who may have, I don't know, some gym equipment that I wish I had, and maybe I'll get the same gym equipment. I mean, you turn on the TV, you see Peloton and you see Nautilus and you see all of these. Maybe I get the same gym equipment because I can afford that, but it's a bit of a stretch, but I can afford it. Okay. But I can't get the same gym equipment and live the same lifestyle as a pitcher on the Yankees making $40 million a year. Can't do that. So we're emulative, but we also emulate ourselves. And we have a ratchet effect, which says that when our spending goes down because we're forced to, because maybe we lose our job or we get our hours cut back or our wages are cut or whatever it is, and we cut back on our consumption, well, as soon as that disposable income is restored, we ratchet back up to where we were before. Our consumption function looks like it was originally, not the lower consumption function that came when we lost our income coming in. That's the relative income hypothesis, and it's very important. I think it's fair. I think most people do that. One of the things that most people do with a passion, and Americans are the poster children for this, is we defend our lifestyle, meaning when we get cutbacks in our disposable income, we make it up by using credit. We borrow in order to maintain our lifestyle, in order to stay in the same house we had, to drive the same vehicle we drive, wear the same clothing, go to the same schools, eat out as often as we did before. And we do that as long as we can before we cut back. So we are very emulative because we defend our lifestyle. But when we have to cut back, we snap back that ratchet effect to where we were in terms of the shape of our consumption function, where we were before the cutback happened. And so that's the relative income hypothesis. We talked about a life cycle hypothesis. And the life cycle hypothesis, authored by Franco Modigliani, a Nobel Prize winner, a professor of economics at the University of Washington, Washington State, a most interesting economist who has done fantastic work to win a Nobel Prize and come up with a theory taught around the world, which we're addressing now. And he's sightless. He's blind. And he's a phenomenal economist. And Modigliani, we owe a lot to in the economics profession. But what Modigliani points out to us is that we have to think about our saving and spending over pieces of our life cycle. So we tend to consume more than 100% of our income when we're young, meaning, let's face it, if you're 12 years old, you may not have any income. So how do you spend? It would be transfer payments. Mom, dad, whoever, can I have a certain number of dollars to buy an ice cream cone? You're spending money, but it's not money that you earned. So maybe you borrow it, or maybe it comes from personal transfers. But then when we enter the working life, our savings build up and grow and grow and grow. Savings will grow and grow and grow until we hit our peak incomes, and then incomes tend to flatten out. And that tends to happen roughly in the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years of our careers, where we've hit our peak. Doesn't mean it comes down, but we tend to peak out, which is interesting. It's a form of age discrimination that's not often talked about, by the way. And then we tend to dis-save when we hit retirement. So notice dis-savings occurs in this chart at roughly age 65. In the US, typical retirement occurs between the ages of 55 and 75, but the bulk of people still retire roughly at age 65. I'm over age 65. I'm still working. I mean, they're going to have to carry me out. I mean, do I dis-save? No, at this point, I don't dis-save. Thank you for the question, because I'm fortunate enough to have a pretty significant income from the work that I do. So no, I'm not dis-saving. And I'm very fortunate in that way, and this will be true of most of you, I hope, and that is a lot of your earnings will come passively, meaning it'll come from your investments. So, remember, you could get income from sources other than wages and salaries and commissions and bonuses. You can get it from capital gains. You can get it from interest. For example, you can get it from profits. So there are ways of earning income that do not necessarily come from a paycheck. So I'm fortunate. I don't need to just save. And I've been fortunate in that, I'm an investment strategist and I do asset allocation. So thank goodness, the stock market has been very, very, how should I put that? A friend of my family. So thank you for the question. And I hope if it's not for you already, that becomes your case. The only thing I will say is it's extremely important for you as young people to learn how to invest and to start doing it at the earliest age that you possibly can. And no sum is too small. I could argue passionately for you that I'm a great believer in the notion that when you ain't got nothing, you ain't got nothing to lose. So a lot of people say, but I only have like $1,000 saved up and I don't want to lose it. And I would say, okay, if that's the way you feel about it, then fine. You can be very conservative. I could also say, if you only have $1,000, you ain't got terribly much, so you ain't got terribly much to lose. Try to turn that 1,000 into 2 or 3. And over time it will, because there's a time value to money that you will learn. So learning how to invest is critical to every person, every household. And I hope that in the course of, if not your academic career at Queens or wherever it is you go, but certainly in your life, you start to think about the importance of investing so that when you get to age 65 or 66 or whenever it is you retire, you don't dissave. And by the way, that's especially important because if you retire at age 65 or 66, the way that people's life expectancy is growing because of healthcare, chances are you're going to live to 90, 95, or 100. And you ask yourself, do I have enough money saved to live for 35 years without a paycheck? If you're not working with a paycheck, then you need 35 years of money to get you by. The standard now is to say that people should assume that they take out 5% of their savings every year. That means you only have enough money for 20 years. But you might live 35, then what do you do? Very important for you to consider that. Okay, one of the things about the life cycle hypothesis is the assumption that people want to have a smooth consumption pattern over time. Meaning, just because you're getting older doesn't mean that you don't want to live the good life. Just because you may be retired, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden you want to not take vacations, not occasionally buy new clothing, not go to restaurants from time to time, not buy holiday gifts and birthday gifts for your family, not give to not make charitable contributions, maybe to your religious institution or to some cause that you're passionate about. Of course you do. So the idea here is that we try to smooth that out. And so when we think about the very ending years of our life and what we need to acquire enough money over time so that we can continue to do that and live this smooth pattern of consumption in life. But keep in mind, life circumstances change a lot. And when we look at people's consumption, their savings, and their wealth, there are a few things that stand out. First, let's pick a stereotype that I apologize to you about because it is a stereotype. So two people get married and then decide that they want to have a child. They have a child and their savings drop precipitously. It's expensive having a baby. Until you've had a baby, and perhaps some of you are parents, 22% of CUNY students are parents. You know that between diapers and different things that are related to the baby, it could even be, clothing and diapers and formula and food and all of that. It's expensive having a baby. So one thing we know is that people's disposable income rises, their savings rise with it, and then they have a baby and the savings drop sharply. Then perhaps, and I agree this is a stereotype, maybe they say, hey, we need a bigger place to live. Let's look for a starter house. Takes a couple of years to build up enough for a down payment. They're savings. Then they buy a starter house. Those savings are used for the down payment. Their savings drop sharply. Then they decide, since they have a starter house, they now have 3 or 4 bedrooms. Maybe now they want to have a second child or a third child. Savings drop again. So it's not a smooth ride out in terms of where their savings are. All the time they're trying to have a smooth consumption pattern where their lifestyle really doesn't change. So life circumstances change you sharply. And you need to be aware of that. If you're not, I mean, I'm sure you are, but I just want to remind you of that. Even though, according to the life cycle hypothesis, we desire a smooth pattern of consumption. Okay, so I'm going to skip this because we've seen it before. I want to remind you that there are multiplier effects. You had a question on your exam about multiplier effects. I want you to remind you, though, that multiplier effects are extremely important. And part of the reason why we look so carefully at consumption is to get a sense of what that marginal propensity to consume is, all relative to tax rates that are going to affect this. So when we combine the two together, how much income do we have? If we gave more income to people, like the checks that many of you maybe have gotten, or your family has, or people you know, you got those checks, what portion of those checks are people going to spend? Now, we've seen some data that said that people are going to spend less than 30% of it, but we need to know that. And then of the amount that gets spent, how much stays in the economy and doesn't get taxed away? That's going to affect the size of the multiplier. And we've gone through this, and of course there was a question on your exam. But as we know, the microeconomic foundations of consumption are very important, and let's go through some of these really quickly. Your income and employment status, of course, and your permanent income. Remember, we talked about Milton Friedman's permanent income hypothesis, in which he said your permanent income involves what you perceive to be your income going out 3 years, but it also involves the amount of wealth that you have, your accumulation of your assets, because you invest those. And I've already addressed that for you in a different context when I said, over time, it may very well be that the bulk of your income comes in from investments and not from a paycheck. It's very important. But it also involves your human capital, which can't be taken away from you. If you have a skill set, even if you're out of work, you can look for a job and probably find one within that skill set. But if you don't have a specific skill set, you say, hey, I'm smart. Hey, I got great grades in college. And someone says, yeah, but what could you do? And you go, well, I'm really smart. I could learn really fast. Well, businesses will tell you, hey, we're not a school. That's why you went to Queens College. Queens College was your school. We're not here to train you. We're not here to teach you a skill. Now, there is a good news kind of an element to this as we sit here in 2021, and that is in many occupations, there are labor shortages, in which case some businesses may be forced to hire people just because they're smart and then be willing to train them. But for the most part, most of the time, I cannot tell you the number of people I've interviewed in my life, and I've hired, I don't even know, somewhere between 100 and 150 people in my life. How many times when interviewing people for positions, I've said to them, I have to tell you, we have a position that we need to fill now. We need somebody who could do that work now. We're not your school. You'll learn while you're on the job. No question, you will learn from this job. But we're not here to teach you that. We have a job that needs to be done. We need somebody to dig a hole or to build a building or to, do investment strategy. We need that now. That's why we're looking to hire somebody. We're not here to be a school. So, yes, your income and employment status matters. Your permanent income matters, among which is your human capital, which is your knowledge, your skills, your experience, and then your soft skills. Will you fit in here? Can you get along with the people who are working side by side with you? How perceptive are you? What kinds of questions do you ask? How do you look? Meaning, do you come to work, You don't want to wear a tuxedo to a football game. Okay, wear a football game and you're interviewing in a tuxedo. That doesn't fit. That's what I mean by look. Or we all wear shirts and ties and suits, and you show up for an interview wearing blue jeans. You don't fit. That's what I meant by that. So we look at all of that. That's all part of your human capital. Next, part of your consumption could very well depend on your transfer payments. A lot of people receive a lot of transfer payments from the governments. And that's not necessarily a reflection of low or moderate income. It could be merely because you've hit age 62 and you qualify for Social Security, which is a transfer payment. You know, the biggest transfer payment system in the United States is Social Security. It's a transfer system from the government to people who are 62 and over. That's true. But it's really a transfer from people who are working to people who are not working. That's why they're receiving Social Security. Well, you could be working and get Social Security, but I think you got the point. That's the transfer that we get. And over time, you know, the number of people contributing relative to the number of people receiving has been dropping because the baby boom generation, my generation, is a bigger generation than the generation that came after it. The people who are working now and are hitting their peak earning years, that's a smaller generation than the generation that are receiving Social Security. So that's a transfer from workers to the government who transfer it, pass it through to people who have hit age 62 or older. You could retire anywhere. You can get Social Security at 62. You must get it as late as age 70. After age 70, not good. You have to get it by age 70. That's your choice. That's transfer payments. How much of your disposable income is discretionary will influence your consumption patterns. Meaning, you have your gross income, you subtract off the taxes, that gives you your disposable income. A part of that is going to be spent, and a sizable part of that is going to be spent on items that are not discretionary. Your health care, your transportation, your food, your housing, etc. Whatever is left over after your necessities of life is discretionary. Well, how much discretionary income do you have? If you don't have discretionary income, you're probably not going to take, a 6-week, cruise around, around Asia, which could be, well over $10,000. It's probably not going to happen. So the amount of discretionary income matters. Obviously, your wealth matters. And your wealth could be not only what you have, but what you anticipate having. There's a song, from Seals and Croft where there's a line that says, you can rely on your old man's money. You can rely on your old man's money. Well, if you anticipate that your old man is going to pass away and you're going to inherit a large amount of money, it affects the way you consume in the marketplace today. But even if that's not a facet of your life, every one of us has a certain amount of wealth. The clothing that you're wearing is part of your wealth. It could be stocks and bonds and real estate and derivatives and all kinds of things that are financial. But we all have different kinds of wealth. You might have jewelry. Maybe you have a diamond ring on your finger that doesn't mean much to you. Could happen, and you can sell it. That's part of your wealth. Well, that's going to affect your consumption. The availability and cost of credit. Right now, the availability of credit is unprecedented in terms of how much is out there. The cost of it is almost unprecedented in terms of interest rates being really low. Of course, that means that businesses, individuals, and others are going to be out there borrowing. But we've seen massive trillions of dollars of money borrowed so that people could make financial investments. Not investments in goods and services and commodities. They're borrowing so they can invest. We call that margin borrowing on margin. And it's in the trillions of dollars. Why do people do that? Why do businesses do that? Why do institutional investors do that? They figure that the cost of that credit relative to what they could earn on those investments is really, really low. So if the margin credit is available, and its cost is really low, you go after it. So obviously age and gender and education and your confidence and where you live and your preferences toward thrift, of course they all matter. Here's one that we're going to be pursuing right now: the time preferences intertemporally, including instant versus delayed gratification. What the heck does that mean? Some people want to enjoy their money now. They don't care about interest rates. They don't care about all these other factors that you see listed here. They want it now. Other people have a different time preference. A lot of people are saying, I'm going to save while I'm young, see that money build up to the extent it can, invest it in different ways so that it can accumulate over time, because I want to make sure that if I want to, I could retire at a relatively early age, maybe 55, and live a great life, maybe do global traveling, or, you know, constantly go visit my grandchildren in California or something. My time preference is that I want to be able to spend later. Other people will say, no, I want to spend now. We're going to talk a lot about that in a couple of minutes when I show you a chart. That matters a lot. Your time preference matters a great deal. Okay? Any questions about anything we've done so far? Or comments? Yeah. Can you explain discretionary income again? It's not discretionary income, it's discretionary spending. It's the share of disposable income that's discretionary. So what are we talking about? It's the spending that you do after you have spent on the necessities of life. So you have a certain amount of income. That income is going to be partially going to taxes, partially going to savings. Whatever is left over is going to be spent on the necessities of life. And anything after that is discretionary. It's at your discretion whether you want to spend all of it, part of it, what do you want to spend it on? So, discretionary spending. Typically falling into discretionary spending would be things like vacations. You know, vacation, I guess some people could argue it's a necessity of life, but it really isn't. I mean, you could have a staycation. Believe me, there's enough to do in New York City really inexpensively that you don't ever have to travel. Between all the museums and the botanical gardens and the World Trade Center and the Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty. And my favorite staycation thing is to take the Staten Island ferry at dusk as the sun is going down, be on the Staten Island ferry, which costs you nothing, and look at the sun glistening off of the office towers. I'm telling you, it is absolutely breathtaking, and it doesn't cost you a thing. Anyway, vacations would be discretionary because you really don't need to take expensive vacations. But food is not discretionary. Your rent or your mortgage is not discretionary. Clothing is not discretionary. You have to have something on your feet. You have to buy shoes. But vacations would be. So I think spending that is at your discretion rather than required of you in some sense or necessary is discretionary spending. And some part, you know, for some of us, you know, who are fortunate to have significant discretion, would going to a restaurant be discretionary? Huh. Yes, it would be. No, eating ice cream's a necessity, none. It is for me. I mean, it's funny. My wife said that before we got married, she'd have ice cream in her freezer that would be there for months and months and never touch it. Since we've been married, the ice cream is there on Sunday and it's gone on Tuesday. Thank you. Great question. Okay, so I hope that answers it. Suppose if I go to New Jersey and live in a relative's house and spend vacation there. I don't know. That's probably not discretionary. Well, it's a vacation. I guess I lump all vacations into discretionary, no matter how inexpensive that might be. You know, living with a relative in New Jersey, Hopefully on the shore, that would be great. Down the shore would be great. But I think you get the point. Um, next week, my wife and I are flying down to Tampa to see our grandchild, our son and our daughter, and our son-in-law and daughter-in-law. Totally discretionary. We don't need to go. Our heart says it's necessary, but the reality is we don't need to. But yeah, we're going down to Tampa to see our family. I would call that discretionary. Okay. Come on. Okay. Keynes's conjectures. We all know this to be true. I'm just going to spend a second on it. Keynes was really the first one who studied consumer behavior, who really came to the conclusion. He conjectured about this. Conjecture is sort of, I'm thinking about it. I really think it's true. Let me go explore it and find out if it is. That the marginal propensity to consume is between 0 and 100%. That's effectively it. And that the average propensity to consume falls as income rises. Of course it does. The average propensity to consume of the billionaires that were just listed by Forbes magazine recently, their average propensity to consume is much smaller than ours. The share of their income that they spend as opposed to invest in different things is way smaller. A-Rod just became the owner of the Minnesota Timberwolves basketball team. Now that's a kind of an expenditure. He bought a baseball team, but really that's an investment. A-Rod's marginal propensity to consume is probably very, very close to 0. You give him another $1, he's probably not going to spend it. He's going to invest it or save it. Okay, so those are Keynes's conjectures. But we live and die on this. I mean, you've already discussed today and in the past multiplier effects, which depend upon the marginal propensity to consume. All very logical. Okay, we're going to end the class today. I mean, we still have about a half hour by going through effectively what is some microeconomics. And for those who, I assume everybody has taken at least one microeconomics course, so I don't need to really go through this. So what you're looking at here is a budget line and indifference curves. And each indifference curve that you see here represents a different level of income. And indifferent means you don't care. So any spot along an indifference curve, you are equally happy. And the higher the indifference curve, like curve number 2 that you see here, the happier you are, because the combinations of C1, which is consumption now, and C2, which is consumption in the future, well, it says that anywhere along this indifference curve, you are equally happy. So you're equally happy at W, X, and Y, but you're happier at Z because you have more combinations of current and future consumption. So anywhere along indifference curve 2, you get more current consumption and potentially more future consumption than anywhere along indifference curve 1. That's what indifference curves mean. But then we have something like a budget constraint, which says each and every one of us makes a decision between consuming now, C1, and consuming in the future, C2. Now, we've already talked about this. Intertemporal choices that we make between consuming now and consuming in the future. All of that is explained in the words that I put here. I taught this to a class, I don't know, a few years ago, and then I said, you know what? I did it orally. Let me write it out for them because the textbook is unclear about this point, so I wrote it out. Very clear, but it's no different than what I just said for you. And then ultimately, where is equilibrium? Where do you get the biggest satisfaction? Of course, where an indifference curve and a budget line cross each other, because if your budget line has a certain height, you may be indifferent between C1 and C2, but how high can you possibly go? Well, you see that in the bottom diagram, and you see that the equilibrium takes place, where the 0 is. So that's the highest possible indifference curve you could get onto, given your preferences between C1 and C2. Very basic introductory microeconomics. I'm not going to go through this except to tell you that all of this is just algebra again. It's just taking concepts that you know and rearranging the terms that you see in the 4 bullet points here. But let's just go through bullet point number on top and the second one. So your savings obviously equal your income Y minus your consumption. We know that. And we're talking about savings now. S1. There should be a 1 underneath the S, but it doesn't matter because you have Y1 and C1. So your savings now depends on your income now minus your consumption now. Nothing new here. But here's a concept for you. What about your consumption in time period 2, your future consumption? Well, we know that your future consumption depends upon your income Y2 in the future, but it depends on something else. It depends upon what you have accumulated in terms of savings over time, because the amount that you have to spend in the future depends upon your income in the future and whatever it is you've saved. We've already talked about the life cycle hypothesis. I already personalized it and told you that, I have an income still, even though I'm 69 years old. I'm not collecting Social Security, and I haven't stopped working. I have an income now, but I also have income that comes from money that I've saved. So Y1 minus C1 on my savings, you see that in the first bullet point, and 1 plus R being the real interest rate, which makes it grow. So assuming that all future income from savings comes from the real interest rate, that makes total sense. Well, then the third and fourth bullet point just tells you, just rearrange the terms. And when you do that, it says this equation relates consumption in both periods, C1 and C2, now and the future, to income in both periods, which is the standard intertemporal budget constraint interpretation. If the interest rate is 0, then consumption in both periods equals the income that you earn in both periods. Well, think about it. If interest is 0 right now, then my consumption is going to depend upon my income now. But if there's never any interest, if R stays 0, then my income in the future is going to be the determinant of my consumption in the future, because it's not going to be from the accumulation of earnings that I've had over time. But the higher the interest rate goes, if R is greater than 0, I'm going to have an incentive to take advantage of that interest to increase the amount that I save now to make the amount of income that I have in the future grow and grow and grow. We've talked about this in the past. We said, hey, look, if the interest rate is near 0, you don't run to, what do I mean by Y2? It's the income in the future. Y1 is income now. Y2 is income in the future. Like, let's say at the time that you retire, okay? Okay. So we've talked about this before. I remember giving you this example when, shortly after I got out of graduate school, short-term interest rates in the United States exceeded 20%. That means you picked up every mattress, you looked under every pillow, you picked up pennies from the floor, and you ran to the bank because you can get 20% interest. Oh my goodness, that means your money doubles in 3.5 years. You ran to the bank and you wanted to accumulate. But right now, interest rates are near 0. If you have a little money, you don't have to run to the bank. I have some earnings that come from real estate. Somebody just sent me a rent check because of a real estate property that I own. I got the check in the mail, I don't know, like a week ago. I haven't run to the bank. What am I going to run to the bank for? The interest rate on it is like 0. So I didn't run to the bank. I'll go and then I'll take that money and invest it in something else. But my point being, when interest rates are really high, you want that money to accumulate. You focus on future consumption. You cut back on your present consumption because, let's face it, every dollar you spend now is a dollar that's not generating income for you. That's the point that's being made here. So that's what we mean by intertemporal, meaning any relationship between past, present, and future events or conditions. That just explains that term to you. And this takes it a little bit further. This takes the example I just gave you, going from a zero interest rate to a positive real interest rate, or in this case, it's just saying that the real interest rate goes up. What happens? Well, what happens is that the budget line shifts, it rotates, it becomes more vertical. Why is that? Well, you can see, it's what I just said. The amount of consumption you want to do now is going to shrink. The amount of consumption that you'll put off into the future will increase. And that consumption in the future actually becomes cheaper because it's not coming out of a paycheck that you had to sweat for. It came out of earnings at a time when you've accumulated more money simply because of time. Simply because of time, you know, just to back up a minute. When you think about investment, you think about three things. You almost learn this in the first day in a personal finance course. PRT, principal, rate, and time. All three of them are your friends. Principal, how much are you putting into your savings? That's your principal. Rate, at what interest rate are you saving that money or investing it? And time, over how much time are you going to allow that principal to grow at that rate? PRT. Well, what this is saying here is, well, over time, if the interest rate goes higher, you're more likely to give up some of your current consumption in favor of future consumption. What it does is it moves the tangent of the budget line to an indifference curve. In this diagram, it moves it up and to the left. You end up on a higher indifference curve, which is consistent with a higher income. Higher income, you would expect more consumption now and more consumption in the future. But the substitution effect, that's an income effect, but the substitution effect says, no, you substitute savings for consumption because the interest rate is higher. So the income effect says you spend more now and more in the future. The income effect says you spend more now and more in the future, and the substitution effect says you spend more in the future and less now. Net net, you end up spending more money, but the effects are different. So again, think about it. The interest rate goes down. Start all over again. If the interest rate goes up, you would expect that people would excuse me, I'm sorry. You would expect that you would end up on a higher indifference curve, which you do, enabling you to have more combinations of C1 and C2, consumption now and consumption in the future. That's your income effect. You end up with more spending of both. But the substitution effect says you end up certainly with more C2, more spending in the future, but less consumption now. Net net between the two, you have two different effects, an income effect and a substitution effect that work off of each other. You end up on a higher indifference curve. You end up net net with less current consumption, more future consumption if interest rates go up. All of this is the math behind what I just explained to you. You can go through that in your own time. We've talked about Ricardian equivalence. Ricardian equivalence says, hey, there's a time dimension to how people think, that even though people may get a boost somehow in their disposable income, perhaps from a tax reduction, Ricardian equivalence says, yeah, but you know what? There's no guarantee necessarily from the tax reduction that they will spend as much more as you think they will, because some people are going to turn around and they will be skeptics and they will say, yeah, well, they cut my taxes now, but guess what? They're going to be going up in the future and I need to prepare for that. So I'm going to cut back on my spending. So you're in the Trump years and you anticipate tax reductions, especially on higher income people. Now you're in the Biden years and you anticipate higher taxes on upper income people. People who are looking at Ricardian equivalents would say, the really wise people in the upper income brackets, being defined now as $400,000 or more, by the way. When Trump cut his taxes, they looked at it and said, it's not going to prevail. If he gets voted out of office, the Democrats will come in, they're going to raise my taxes. That would be the kind of thinking consistent with Ricardian equivalents. So, case study, behavioral economics and consumption. The fastest growing field in economics, I believe, is behavioral economics. Look at the two words, behavior and economics, psychology and economics. It's one thing to say that there's an irrefutable relationship between disposable income and consumption, and that's true. It has held through history, and it will continue to hold through history. But understanding the psychology behind it is so important. Just think for a moment. Some of the things you look at when you look at behavioral economics. And if you're really interested in behavioral economics, the website of Allianz Global Investors is big on behavioral finance and behavioral economics. And you can go to George Mason, Mason University. They have won several Nobel Prizes in economics for their work in behavioral economics. But think about it for a minute. We've talked about a lot of reasons how and why people come to spend the amount that they do. But look at yourself for a moment. Let's look at something like eating, okay? Because we have to buy food, whether it's in a restaurant or whether we buy it and prepare it ourselves, or we just buy some prepared food and open up a can or, something frozen. Why do we eat the way we do? Well, one could argue that we eat for maximum nutrition. Sure. Some would say, I eat because it makes me feel good. It just does. When I'm feeling lousy, maybe I just failed an economics test and I'm feeling lousy, I open the refrigerator and I eat and I eat and I eat. Some people will say, I eat and I eat and I eat when I'm feeling great. I just got 95 on an economics test and I'm rewarding myself by eating Non's ice cream, by eating ice cream. I go to the refrigerator and I eat that ice cream to reward myself. So do we eat to reward ourselves? Do we eat to punish ourselves? Look at the psychology behind it. Do I eat for nutrition? Do I eat a certain way because that's really all I can afford? I mean, there are cheap foods, cheap, and I mean that both in terms of cheap meaning low quality and cheap meaning inexpensive, that will fill your belly, but they may not be nutritious, So you stuff yourself with that really because maybe that's all you can afford. You can't afford high quality and often expensive protein, let's say. You eat, but not because you're hungry. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's just habit. Gotta have, every time I have coffee, I have to have a piece of cake. My dad was like that. I could never figure this out. My dad could never have a cup of coffee. He always had to have something with it. I don't know. I drink like 100 cups of coffee. I don't have to do that, but my dad always had to have something with it. So here's the point. Whether it's food or clothing, like my wife buys so much clothing. I'm glad. I better talk low. I don't want her to hear this. And I say to her, did you really need to buy that blouse? And she said, no, I just wanted to buy it. I go, but you have, in the closet, you have things hanging there that still have tags on them. You've never worn them. She goes, yeah, but I went on Amazon and I saw this blouse. I really wanted it. So when we think about the reasons why we buy things, there's a lot of psychology behind it. And so that would explain, again, some of them. They look good in the closet. Oh man, I got to tell that one to my wife. I'll tell you, I really enjoy you guys. Thank you so much for your sense of humor and for your patience with me and for, my awful stories. It's what happens when you get old. You live in the past and you tell stories from the past. So now I'll tell you one that'll really make you sick really fast. I was lying in bed this morning and I said to myself, oh my goodness, I've taught economics in parts of 6 different decades. I started teaching in the 70s, 1, in the 80s, 2, in the 90s, 3, in the zeros between 2000 and 2009, that's 4, between 2010 and 2020, that's 5, and now we're in 2021. I've taught in parts of 6 different decades, and I've loved every minute of it. So here's the point. It says people are rational, but oftentimes people are irrational. But what if people are bad at math? What if they're rational but make the wrong decision? Yeah, people do. We make all kinds of decisions, and sometimes they're rational, sometimes they're irrational. But the point here is that psychology matters, and it's for that reason why a student, I think in my other class, asked me about soft data. Remember, we did hard data and soft data, and this, I don't know if it was your class or the other one, and this student said, well, like soft data, like the consumer confidence index from the conference board, can we really trust that? Well, yes, we can. I'm not going to go into that now. But the point is, look what it's looking at, consumer confidence, because it plays into the ways in which we spend. The psychology matters. People look at, they're saving, and most people, unfortunately, don't have access to things like 401k plans. They really don't. You work in a small business, or even if you work in places that are very large businesses, they may not offer you savings plans. Or if you work in government, 403b plans, which are the equivalent of 401ks. But think about this for a moment. When I worked at the Federal Reserve, I used to do personal finance programs during lunch hours for my colleagues. And I used to ask them, how many of you are in the savings plan? And like half the people in the room would raise their hand. They go, why are you not in the savings plan? Every dollar you put into the Federal Reserve Bank of New York savings plan gets matched 100%. So if you put in 3% of your income, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York matches that 3%, which means you got a 100% rate of return on your savings with no risk. 100% rate of return at no risk. And people would say, yeah, can't do it. I mean, if I put the money in the savings plan, I can't pay my rent. I don't have enough money. And you say, that's absurd. You can't get 100% rate of return with no risk. So I would say to them, I'll tell you what, I have a chance for you to make a 75% rate of return with no risk. Would you like that? To go, yeah. I said, okay, take every single credit card you can get, max it out to the limit, pay the 25% interest rate, and you're still up 75%. And people would look at me like I'm nuts. And I would tell students, if you don't have a student loan, go take it out. Those are incredibly favorable interest rates. Take out all the money you possibly can by borrowing from the government or from a private source for student loans, and then go invest that money. People don't think that way. They look at it and they say, no, I have to take the income that I have and spend it. But they don't think in terms of rates of return on investment, when in fact the quality of your future life is going to depend on your quality of your investments. We're in a low wage growth environment that's going to last for decades more. If you're waiting for the 2 or 3% pay increase that you're going to get on average over your lifetime to give you a big boost up in your standard of living, meaning what you are able, if you choose to spend and save, it ain't happening. It's got to come from investment. So think about that. But to argue I can't save and get a 100% rate of return with no risk, I can't do that. Well, there are ways around that. Just borrow money to do that. So we've talked about savings rates. Savings rates in the US right now are very elevated, and that's because people got transfer payments from the government, and the marginal propensity to consume that, as we saw in the last time we had a class, was only in the 25 to 30% range. So obviously savings rates are up, and that's good. It enables people to do lots of things. When you save, You think, do you think taking, I didn't see that. Do I think taking a loan, whoever wrote that, would you repeat your question orally?
Professor, do you think taking out a loan to fund investments is a good idea, given interest rates? Just curious.
I think it's a good idea, but on one condition. You have to make sure that you make the right investments. Because if you borrow that money and the risks in that, thank you, Sujan, and the risks in that investment are really high and that investment goes down dramatically, now you have a loss on your investment and you still owe the money. So it depends how you invest the money into what kinds of opportunities. That's where learning how to diversify and how to understand and use risk favorably is good. But there are times when it makes sense to borrow money to make investments. That may not be true of everybody. It depends on individual circumstances. So I'm not giving you any investment advice. It is illegal for me to give you investment advice. All I would say is, for some people, some of the time, it makes sense to do that. Let's face it, if you could borrow money at negative interest rates in Europe, think about that. They're paying you to take money off their hands. My goodness. There's a circumstance where people should be lining up out the door to borrow money. Okay? So household debt has fallen as a percent of GDP because people are paying back their loans. Personal savings rates. Now, this only goes to 2019. Look at the numbers, ladies and gentlemen. Normally, at least since 2010, averaging around 5 or 6%. We're now triple that because of the transfer payments. Household wealth has grown precipitously. Household wealth, and this is always fun to do, is to go to the Federal Reserve's Z as in zebra, Z1 report, and this is where the personal wealth numbers come from. And you can see that personal wealth comes really from two things. It comes from small businesses. Remember, households own small businesses that may be unincorporated. So it could be that the pizza shop on your block or the dry cleaning establishment, whatever, is personal wealth. It's not corporate wealth. And of course, now, because people's homes have gone up so much in value, and because the stock market is at record levels, household wealth is at record levels relative to income. Okay. I guess I'm going to end here. There's really no reason for me to go any further. So I think what you take away from the class today is that we look very, very carefully at people's intertemporal choices between spending now and later. And a lot of that has to do with where interest rates are, because the higher the interest rates, the more likely you are to realize that future consumption has gotten really cheap because you're spending money that accumulated because the interest payments to you have piled up. It also means that spending now has become more expensive. Every dollar you spend now is a dollar you didn't put into savings that didn't generate income for you. So we watch that very carefully. You should take away the most important truism in economics, and that is that consumption is a function of disposable income. It's always true. But as we know, there are other factors in here from the different theories of consumption. Could be wealth, it could be your human capital, it could be where you are in the life cycle, it could be how you choose to emulate yourself when you are at your best, or your neighbor next door who spends in a certain way. We know that there's a huge behavioral element to consumption that we pay attention to. We know that we have to pay attention as economists both to services, non-durables, and durables, but we also have to take a look at that spending which is discretionary and which is non-discretionary. Non-discretionary meaning, the factors that are necessities in life. But we pay a lot of attention to discretionary spending. And indeed, on Wall Street, when we look at stocks and we break it down by sector, we look at discretionary and non-discretionary spending. Companies that service people or provide non-discretionary goods and services, and companies that provide discretionary goods and services. We watch that very carefully. We know that savings rates, of course, they're going to be a function of how much people get in transfer payments, what the general condition of the economy is going to be, their confidence at any moment in time, where interest rates reside, etc. So these are the kinds of things you take away from a class like this, which I hope you found interesting. I always did. How would we enroll in a 401k as a private organization? It has to, 401ks have to be offered by your employer. Now, if your employer has one, some employers have an opt-out, meaning as soon as you get hired by that employer, you are in the 401k plan. And if you don't want it, you have to tell them, I don't want it. Other employers have an opt-in. When you get hired, you have to say, I want to get into the 401k. But not everybody has access to that. And so you may choose to have a 401k, but your employer may not offer it. So as we leave the class today, I just want to beg you, I'm begging you on hands and knees. I don't know whether you get it from your formal education at Queens College, whether you get it by reading or watching Bloomberg or CNBC or reading the Wall Street Journal, or all of the above, which is what I do. I'm begging you to learn the fundamentals of investing. It is so critical to your future life. And it's likely to come up in whatever occupation you go into, because let's face it, if you get hired by any kind of big firm, that first day you're there, you're going to be with human resources people, and they're going to say, okay, we have a 401k, and how do you want to invest the money in the 401k? And if you look at them like, what's a 401k? Or, oh, there are investment options. I mean, I could put it into fixed income. I could put it into growth stocks. I could put it into value stocks. I could put it into a multi-asset plan. I could put it into commodity. If you look at them like you don't know, you're going to be asked about what kind of medical insurance do you want? We have 3 or 4 different medical plans. If you don't know how to decipher medical plans, you don't know what to do. And it could make a huge difference. Choosing the wrong medical plan, oh my goodness. It could have profound impacts on your discretionary spending shrinking because you're paying a doctor or a pharmaceutical company or a hospital, when if you had picked a different medical plan, you would have been better off. So understanding the basics of medical plans. My final sentence, I can only guarantee you 3 things, and then we will sign off. Number 1 is that you're going to die someday, which means I don't care if you're 20 years old, you have to have a will. Otherwise, the state will decide what to do with whatever you have. And if your parents don't have wills, make them make out a will. Number 2, at some point you're going to get sick, so you need good medical insurance. And number 3, at some point in your life you will stop working, so you have to save and invest. 3 things: you will die, you will stop working, and you will get sick. 3 guarantees of life. Think about that as you plan your careers, as you plan how you handle your own money. Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you for being patient. I hope you enjoyed today's class. And we'll get together on Wednesday when we will talk about investment, not consumption. So we're going on to the next chapter. Okay, bye-bye, folks.
I have a question before you leave.